So I wanted to share this video with you guys. So I'll give you a quick story and some verses here, but and the verses might run a little longer, but just want to share this with you. So story is this. So October of 2022, I took a trip to Israel, and while I was on that trip in Israel, we were at a site, and our tour guide was talking about the birth of Jesus and how Jesus was born on October 14th. And so I was half paying attention. He says October 14th. It piques my interest. And why that piques my interest is because that's my birthday. And so we go to this week, we had October 14th again. And um, this guy messaged on my Facebook page, happy birthday. And I reached out to him and messaged him back and just, hey, I remember when I was in Israel, you talked about that Jesus was born, this time of year, mid-October. Can you send me a summary of that or kind of help me get how understand that better? And so he sent me a picture of his handwritten notes on that. And so a lot of it was verses, and most of it was verses, a few notes with some specific dates. And so I'll share all that with you today. But then that's spurred me on to look into these verses, make my own notes, and kind of navigate that and see how that all plays out and if it fits together. And so that's what I want to share with you now. So I'm going to walk through these verses with you and share these thoughts with you and help you kind of go through this with me like I went through it. So we're going to start in the Old Testament. We're going to start in First Chronicles, and we're starting chapter 24, specifically verse 10. And so it says, it's a very short verse. It just says the seventh to Hakaz and the eighth to Abijah. And so right now that might mean nothing to you, but I'm going to help explain that to you, and we're going to dig in and go through. We're going to jump to the New Testament and go through that. So, what's going on in this passage? So, what's going on is David is dividing up duties. And so, Aaron had four sons. Two of those sons have already passed away, two of them are still living. The two that are still living are Eleazar and Ithamar. So, two sons, Eleazar, Ithamar, who also have sons. And so David is dividing up the duties of the temple amongst these sons. Eleazar had 16 sons, Ithamar had eight, that's 24 sons. So they begin to cast lots. We can think of that as almost like rolling dice to see who the order of who serves in the temple win. And so if we go back to the verse, the seventh to Hakaz and the eighth to Abijah. So what I want to focus in on is the second half of that verse, the eighth to Abijah. So as they're casting these lots, the eighth one goes to Abijah. All right, we're going to keep going. It's going to make more sense here in a second. So now we're going to jump to the New Testament. We're going to go to Luke. We're going to go to chapter 1, and we're starting verse 5. It says, and all these verses I'm reading on the ESV version of the Bible. So verse 5 says, in the days of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah of the division of Abijah. If you're like me, that's maybe never jumped out to you before, but it jumps out to me now. So we just read about Abijah was the eighth lot cast in First Chronicles 24. Now it shows up here again in Luke chapter 1. So Zechariah is of the division of Abijah. The verse continues and he says, and he had a wife from the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. So as we fast forward from the Old Testament all the way up here to Luke, we can see the lineage of Zechariah and Elizabeth come from the division of Abijah. All right, let's keep going. So there was a biblical historian named Josephus, and Josephus was born around 37 AD, just after Jesus' crucifixion. He was a Jewish priest, historian, lived through about, we believe, AD 100. Okay. And so we learn through Josephus' writing, this historian, that these priests would serve 1 week at a time. So the 24 we just read about in First Chronicles, now we only talked about the seventh and the eighth, but the 24 divisions would serve a week at a time. And so they would serve from end of Sabbath to end of Sabbath. So sundown on Saturday to sundown on Saturday. Okay. So as we go through this, this rotation restarted the first week of Nicene every year. Okay. What's the first week of Nicene? The first week of Nicene, or Nicene, just that term, let's stick on that for a second. Nicene was the Hebrew Jewish religious calendar as based on the moon, the lunar calendar. Typically, the first week was typically late March, early April. And we know how the moon is. It's the cycles are a little different, so it's not always the same day of every month. So typically late March, early April. Okay. So if we think through this, and the eighth lot was given to Abijah, so Abijah would have served the 8th week, the first week starting late March, early April. 8 weeks later, Zechariah would have served late May or early June. Okay, let me read this again. So we go back to that verse. Get in here. In the days of King Herod, in the days of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah of the division of Abijah. Okay. So the 8th week, late May, first 2 days of June, gives a lot of detail here. Gabriel appears to Zechariah and tells him his prayer has been heard. He's serving in the temple. You can read this in chapter 1 of Luke. And that him and Elizabeth in their old age will bear a son. Great. We've read that before. If you read the Christmas story, you probably read that dozens of times. We pick up now in verse 23 of chapter 1 of Luke. It says, and when his time of service ended, he went to his home. After these days, his wife Elizabeth conceived, and for 5 months she kept herself hidden. Okay, so he serves, does his week in the temple, late May, early June. After his time was ended, he went to his home. After these days, his wife Elizabeth conceived. So we can go down that road and say that John the Baptist was most likely conceived in early June. Okay. Tour guide says June 6th. I believe he has done a lot of research on the cycles of the moon and with Nicene and how all lines up is how he comes to these specific dates. But I'm just going to say for now, early June. Again, he has specifically June 6th down. Okay. Now let's stay in Luke, but let's advance further in the chapter to verse 36. We're in 1:36. It says, and behold, your relative in her old age has also, and behold, your relative Elizabeth in her old age has also conceived a son, and this is the 6th month with her who is called barren, for nothing will be impossible with God. Okay. So now we're advancing 6 months. So Elizabeth has now been pregnant for 6 months. This is a message to Mary, as we know. So if we do our math, doesn't take hard math, 6 months from June is now puts us in December. Okay. Early December, mid-December, I'm not sure, but we'll just say mid-December. So it would make sense that Jesus was conceived in December. As we know in this time, in our culture, we call that Hanukkah in the Jewish calendar, the Jewish culture. It also can be called the Festival of Lights or the Feast of Dedication. And so my tour guide believes that, it was December 22nd. I'm saying mid-December, December 22nd. I'm saying mid-December. So he also shared the verse with me and thinks there's a connection here if we read John 1:4 and this time of Festival of Lights and Jesus's conception. But it says, John 1:4 says, in him was life, and the life was the light of men. Light of men. And then it goes on, it says, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. So there's more there we could unpack with just the thought of Festival of Lights and why they celebrated this, and the menorah and the 8 days and the Maccabees and on and on. But for this video, we're going to keep moving, and you can dig into that on your own if you like. But I think there's a lot of depth there we could get into as well. So let's go back to chapter 1 of Luke. Let's go down to verse 39. And it says, verse 39 says, "In those days, Mary arose and went with haste into the hill country to a town in Judea, and she entered the house of Zechariah and greeted Elizabeth." Okay. So Jesus conceived in December, Festival of Lights. She leaves in haste and goes and visits Zechariah and Elizabeth. Now jump further down to verse 56, and you can go back and read all of chapter 1 here, but we're skipping some of these verses. Verse 56 says, "And Mary remained with her about 3 months and returned to her home." Okay, so she's with Elizabeth for 3 months, and then she goes home. Verse 57 continues, says, "Now the time came for Elizabeth to give birth, and she bore a son." All right, following the timeline here, John would have most likely been born around late March to mid-April. Okay, which would have been the time of Passover. This could be very symbolic. My tour guide believes around April 15th. Okay, so we're saying mid-April. Let's keep going. It could have been early April, but similar time frame. So now if we go to chapter 2 of Luke, verse 7, it says, "And she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling cloths and laid him in a manger because there was no place for them in the inn." Okay. So if we go 6 months later, just following the normal calendar, normal pregnancies here, that would put us into late September or early October. Okay. Tour guide believes that Jesus was probably born on October 15th. I don't know. I haven't done that research, but I feel like I can say late September, early October. What's going on during that time? The Feast of Tabernacles, which occurs at this time. So what is the Feast of Tabernacles? You may also hear it referred to as the Festival of Booths. You might hear it called, or temporary shelters. It was a feast where all Israelite men made a pilgrimage back to Jerusalem. This feast is a reminder how God cared for Israel during the Exodus or after the Exodus. You can read more about this in Leviticus 23, where it talks about the temporary shelters for 7 days and kind of the symbolism there. So we also remember from our Christmas story that the inns were full, and we know that Caesar Augustus sent out a decree for everyone to be registered. Okay, and now we know too that if it happened during this time, you have this major religious festival also happening known as the Feast of Tabernacles. So you have Caesar Augustus declaring a decree for registration, which is basically a census, and you have the Feast of Tabernacles going on at the same time, which would make a lot of sense here of why the inn was so, there was no space, right? And the amount of symbolism here with these different Jewish holidays, from John the Baptist being born possibly around Passover, and Jesus being conceived around Festival of Lights, and Jesus being born around Feast of the Tabernacles. Just kind of almost seems like, why didn't we line these up? They all seem to make sense that they're all happening during these times. So let's go a little bit further here, and we'll finish up here. So if we go to Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 14, says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, and glory as the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth." So we have the Festival of Tabernacles going on. In the Old Testament, a tabernacle was a dwelling place. You might remember that or know that, or a tent or a portable sanctuary. So it just seems very interesting that we're reading that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. during the Feast of the Tabernacles, which tabernacle means dwelling place. Um, it seems just very profound. And again, there's just a ton of depth here. Um, I don't think when we're going through this timeline, this calendar, you're having to make any hard leaps to make the calendar work. I think it all lines up almost perfectly. And so, um, just to wrap things up here, I think this provides a good timeline for when he was born. Probably not December 25th. I think we probably all know that. I've also heard he was born in the springtime. I don't really see how that fits. Maybe we could get there somehow. But most likely during the Feast of Tabernacles in late September to mid-October. And so I've also thought, well, does it ultimately matter when Jesus was born? Probably not, but it's just kind of interesting to see how the Bible gives us the pieces to make it fit and when it probably was. So check it, fact check it. If you see anything I'm missing here, let me know. But I hope this helps.